the Fed has been complicit with a deficit spending Congress and White House. And now we don't want the Fed to make monetary decisions based on what it costs the government to finance. But I think a lot of people are saying our only way out of this is to inflate away the U.S. government debt, which is certainly a disservice to American citizens who don't like to have their purchasing power eroded out from under them.
Yeah, you'd certainly think so. I'm curious here. Talk to me a little bit about, and to our viewers, about how the Fed's mission came to fruition here. I mean, are they adhering to the original mission that they kind of created? Where are we at?
It depends how far back we want to go in saying original mission. When the Fed was created in 1913, we were still on the gold standard. So there was no issue as far as the Fed has monetary policy. That isn't what determined the money supply. That discipline was inherent because we were still on the international classical gold standard. In those days, the purpose of the Fed was to just provide an elastic currency. Elastic in the sense that as a largely agrarian economy, we had to service farmers, and seasonally, farmers sometimes had great need to borrow for equipment, for seeds, for sowing their crops, and then later in the year at harvest time, they sold their crops for money, and they were able to put cash back into the bank, and it was to smooth out those cycles, which sometimes left banks a little high and dry, and then other times sort of overly full with deposits. And so the Fed was just a way to help smooth that out. It wasn't really until, I would say, 1977 and 78, we had two very powerful acts of legislation that provided the Fed with its famous dual mandate, which was actually a triple mandate. The Fed is supposed to promote stable prices, maximum employment, and moderate long-term rates. We sometimes forget about that part. I'm not sure why, because to me that implies that you would have a normal yield curve. So whenever we have an inverted yield curve, as we do currently, it seems to me the Fed is violating that third part of the mandate. But their emphasis is always on the first two. It's just that the Fed has interpreted the mandate of promoting stable prices. I mean, when you think of price stability, it means you don't have increases in prices.
Right.
That would imply zero inflation. But the Fed says no. Stable prices are if we have 2% inflation every year. So that actually means, and you can go on the Federal Reserve website, go to the St. Louis District Bank of the Federal Reserve System, and they will explain the 2% target rate means that the Fed is deliberately taking measures that will cause your purchasing power to decrease 2% every year. Now, I think that low and perpetual inflation does harm over time to the economy. Just think of a house that you own for 10 years, and the change in its value at the end of that 10 years is significant. It's sort of like, maybe this is a strange example, but tectonic plates in an earthquake. If they were sliding apart 2% a year, and after 10% there was a 20% gap or a change, that to me leads to instability. And I think that it would be much better if the Fed did define stable prices to mean targeting 0%. I mean, if that goes to another question, can they do it? Because the Fed wants to take credit for bringing inflation down from 9% in the summer of 2022 to closer to 2% today. Then why not go all the way? And there are at least three reasons that the Fed will put up for why they want 2% versus 0. But I think we need to examine all three reasons. One is based on money illusion, that people will be happier if their nominal wages go up, even if they're actually getting a decrease in their purchasing power. So a little bit of inflation might camouflage a real loss in purchasing power, even if they got a 1% gain in their nominal wage. I think people are smarter than that. I think we've seen through union bargaining that people are very aware that if their wage gains do not keep up with inflation, they have had purchasing power effectively expropriated by the government through an independent government agency, which is our Federal Reserve. Another reason put up is that if you have some inflation, it gives the Fed more policy space. That is, if the real rate of interest is about 2.5%, which it is historically, if you add another 2% inflation, then that gives the Fed, say, 4.5% to play with before they get down to zero. I don't think the economy benefits when the Fed tries to artificially stimulate the economy. I think it ends up just distorting the value of financial assets, and then it takes us a long time to recover from that. Finally, there's concern that, well, if you ever slipped into deflation, and that's put out as just a huge risk. Well, in China, let's say if you see deflation, it's more a reflection of much deeper, more fundamental economic problems. In the case of China, where the government is way overly involved in managing the economy, a little bit of deflation is really a more natural state. I mean, we know that as you get the advancements of technology and through productivity, that the natural behavior of the price level in general is to come down. You can get phones, laptops, lots of things more cheaply today, better products than when they first were introduced, and many consumer goods, for many of them, that is true. So I think a small amount of deflation is not so bad. And in fact, if the Fed targeted zero, it would still be a mildly inflationary way to conduct monetary policy. So for all those reasons, I think we need to reevaluate that target. And that would be fundamental reform of the way our Federal Reserve currently operates. When I was going through the nomination process, I would have some people cite my commendation of the discipline inherent in gold and the historical connection between gold and monetary systems as being kind of a crank right-wing fringe theory. But sometimes I would share op-ed columns that were asserting these things with Alan Greenspan, who's been a longtime colleague. And I remember his response would be, if gold is such a worthless metal, why does the United States government and all major governments hold so much of it in storage? And so I think we can start with that. I think gold is universally recognized as a form of currency. It's so widely held around the world by individuals as well as companies and governments. It has industrial use. It's used in jewelry. So in that sense, it has intrinsic value. But I'm sure today, even people, I don't want to sound too James Bond-ish, but if you are stranded in a foreign country for military or other reasons and you're trying to buy your way out, having some gold coins is usually key to convincing someone to assist you. Maybe when we hear talk of making America great again, for many people that might harken back to the 50s and the 60s, which were definitely when the Bretton Woods system was in full force. I would say it did become political during the era when the United States was fighting the Vietnam War. So in the late 60s, we had especially a lot of pressure on the budget, running budget deficits. It was also a time of entitlement spending on social programs under President Lyndon Johnson. And the U.S. was inflating. Those inflated dollars were paying for goods overseas. The other countries who were part of the Bretton Woods system were accumulating dollars. So they accused us of exporting our inflation, which was true. We were. And at some point, some of our allies, England and France, said and acted on the privilege they had to trade those dollars in. And as they turned in those dollars, the gold was leaving our country. And by August of 1971, Paul Volcker, who was the Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs at the Treasury Department at the time under President Nixon, went to Camp David with President Nixon and said, we have to close access to the gold window, or they're going to keep taking away the gold, and the system won't work anymore. Right. And we're just getting to a critical level. But Paul Volcker always thought, and he wrote about this subsequently in his books, that we would go back to the Bretton Woods system, but at a revalued rate of convertibility. So Nixon made his speech August 15th, 1971, on a Sunday. He had to interrupt a very popular cowboy show, Bonanza, that day to tell the American people that we are temporarily ending this system and we're going to build a new international monetary system. That didn't come about because it turned out, and while Americans probably thought, all right, the way it's been framed by President Nixon, his program also included wage and price controls and some other things, but they thought, well, maybe it's for the best. He said other countries and currency speculators are taking advantage of the United States. In any case, for the next year and a half, we tried to set up a new rate. Remember, it was at $35 per ounce of gold. Volcker thought maybe at 39. Then it went to 40. That is the black market rate, we'll say, the market rate for gold and the dollar. Meantime, other countries around the world were calling this the Nixon shock. They thought this was a massive displacement in global financial stability. By February of 73, gold hit $42 an ounce. And at that point, through something called the Smithsonian Agreement, the system was absolutely ended. And that is why today the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department carry our gold holdings as an asset, but they value them at a book value or statutory. Since this came out of that Smithsonian Agreement, the book value is $42.22 per ounce. So with gold at well over $2,700 an ounce, that's quite a windfall profit potentially to be gained between the market value of those gold holdings and the way they are carried and have been carried for 53 years.
But how does the U.S. go about revaluing the gold that it holds here? I mean, to your point, we've seen this shift during the last decade or so, with global central banks deciding to hold more and more gold in their reserves since commencing a buying spree back in 2010. This year, we hit multiple records on the gold front. I think it was last trading at above $27.50 an ounce, a staggering 33% year to date.
This is why I have obviously strong feelings about money being a moral contract. I think our government owes us some money. We have to use our legal tender. And I think that we deserve to have money that fulfills those functions and where value isn't expropriated, where the purchasing power isn't deliberately taken away, where the dollar isn't debased as a function of the Federal Reserve's framework. But I know it's not enough to just rant about how money, in the sense that the founding fathers of America intended it to be regulated. They thought money should be, that Congress should have the power to regulate the money in the same way that Congress had the power to define the official weights and measures for this new country. That is, money was supposed to be an unvarying standard. They even hoped it would become a universal standard, that they would define the dollar in terms of a precise weight of gold and silver, and that would become the dollar that could end up, if America lived up to the dreams of the founders, defining the universal monetary standard. So we've come a long way from that, but what I'm suggesting is that we try to capture some of that windfall gain by not by selling the gold. You could sell it. Gordon Brown did that for England, and most people think it was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made as prime minister. No, don't sell it, because then that money goes down a rat hole. I mean, I think it would be wasted. What I think we need to do is use the value of the gold, use that gold or gold holdings as specific collateral for a new treasury instrument, a long-term treasury bond, absolutely collateralized by gold, and audit the gold holdings, definitely audit the gold holdings, assure everyone it's actually there. But that particular instrument that I'm suggesting, so that I'm doing something more concrete than just complaining about our monetary situation today and the need to get back to a sound dollar, I'm saying we should pursue this initiative specifically to have Treasury issue something I'm calling Treasury Trust bonds. And someone who buys a Treasury Trust bond would have the right at maturity to either take the face value, the dollar denominated face value of that bond, or the pre-specified amount of gold. It would be their option to take either the face value in dollars or this predetermined amount of gold. Because I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that the dollar used to be as good as gold. And there's a lot to be said for having an asset that also functions as money, that really in the future you still own the same amount of that asset. That is, if you buy an ounce of gold today, 10 years from now, you still own a full ounce of gold. Versus if you have the dollar equivalent today, you know for certain, as a matter of policy, it will be worth, those dollars will be worth substantially less in the future. So I think we need to get back to money being an authentic store of value. And by establishing this instrument, it wouldn't be the largest category of debt security offered by the US Treasury, but it wouldn't be the smallest one either. There was another instrument introduced in 2014 that represents about $600 billion worth of claims against the US government. So it would be larger than that. And what I really think this Treasury Trust bond would be most comparable to would be TIPS, the Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities, because they also compensate the bondholder for inflation. It's just that they do it by giving a cost of living adjustment to the bondholder, so that a bondholder who's willing to lend money to the US government nevertheless doesn't want to have the interest rate they're getting completely overwhelmed by a loss in purchasing power. So they buy a TIPS bond because they know they'll be compensated for that. Versus on other Treasury instruments, you take your chances. You're bidding based on your estimated impact of future inflation. Right. Well, this would be a similar deal, a similar payoff to the bondholder. It's just that for people interested in Treasury Trust bonds, instead of a CPI, a Consumer Price Index determined compensation, they're saying I measure inflation, or say the potential decline in dollar purchasing power based on this commodity. I see gold as a surrogate for the real economy. That's my link to reality. For that bondholder, this is their insurance. This is their guarantee that even if the dollars are worth substantially less in the future, they know they will get back that amount of gold. And so that's determining their return on this loan to the US government.
Yeah, I'm so curious, when it comes to these bonds, you're talking about 50 years. So elaborate a little bit here, Judy, as to what that time frame represents and why. I mean, specifically because we've been talking about this 33% rally just this year in gold. So what does that mean, the 50 years?